You're listening to The Breakup Theory, conversations on ending things and collective liberation. We're back with another entry in our letters episodes. In this conversation, Caroline and I discussed 3 different dilemmas presented to us by listeners. In the first, we addressed the problems that come with queer longing and the difficulty of living single amidst the horrors of the world and social arrangements for couples. The second letter raises issues of ethics in relation to friendships. Do you break up with a friend whose job you have a moral objection to? Are you obligated to tell them? Remember, as the Endless Merch says, all cops are bastards. And finally, the third letter comes from a haunted house, where the writer is battling ghosts in a very specific and terrible situation with an abusive ex, while still harboring an expansive dream of liberation for all. I want to give a content warning here. The letter discusses sexual assault with some upsetting details, so if you're not up for that, turn the episode off after the second letter. I really love the chance to discuss these questions, so I'm really grateful for everyone who sends them in. I hope that our conversations prove helpful to you as we look for things from multiple angles. These issues are so often, despite particular details, shared experiences, and common struggles. And like with everything else, there are not many places to untangle the conjunction of relationships and our desires for liberation and anarchy, to step out of self-help into collective struggle. If you want to submit something for us to discuss on the show, you can write us at forum.jotforum.com/thebreakuptheory/stories. Or you can call us at 917-426-6548. You share your breakup stories, your questions about anything, your hopes for liberation, and we'll bring them on the show and discuss them. If you like the show, please share with your friends and rate and follow us wherever you get podcasts. You can also support the project and my writing by subscribing to my Patreon, patreon.com/thebreakuptheory. If you have any extra cash, you can sign up for $5 a month, though nothing there is paywalled. On the Patreon, I regularly post both short and long written pieces, along with episodes and other conversations I'm having. I'm so grateful for all of you supporting me in this project. The Breakup Theory is a member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. CZN brings together a slew of amazing audio projects, so check them out at channelzeronetwork.com. Okay. Here we are for another entry of agony. Thank you for everyone who sent the letters, and we're going to get right into it, talking about the things that people are dealing with. Caroline, would you like to read our first letter?
Yes, I will. Dear Shuli, thanks for the pod. Big fan. I'm someone who has always wanted a serious romantic relationship, but haven't found one. I get crushes easily, but actually forming relationships never seems to pan out. Unrequited love/queer yearning is a general theme for me. I try to focus on my platonic friendships to fill my love cup, but there is a part of romantic partnership that I feel like I'm missing out on. I feel like I see couple privilege everywhere. As a single person, it just is harder to survive through the hellscape of 2024, and it's not talked about enough. All the advice I get is terrible dating advice or pressure to date people I don't have connection with, instead of ideas or support for making my life as a single person more awesome and liberating. Basically, how do I find my Bashert? And why is it so hard? And am I better off single? Is the waiting going to destroy me before capitalism does? Dean Spade has some offerings about debunking the romance myth, and I really wish more anarchists embraced this and people in couples tried harder to support single people in their life. Also, your podcast answers a lot of questions about polyamory, but I don't even know if I'm poly because I can't find one partner. Sincerely, looking for love.
And just Bashert is like kind of idea of soulmate, like
Soulmate.
Yeah. And well, you said like everyone feels this yearning. And I was thinking about that for a second because I was like, oh yeah, like in some ways, I think even regardless of what your like coupling status is, I think there is a certain kind of interior feeling or identification with this idea of being the one who wants. And it's like, and it's not met in some way. But then I was like, oh, does everyone experience it? Like, for me, it's like a kind of strong part of my identity formation in some way that started when I was like going through puberty, like this idea of like being outside, looking in and desiring and never being able to have that met. And so it does feel deeply ingrained for me. And obviously that's like, it's also connected to all the like sex and gender issues too, but I don't know if everyone feels that way. Like I think some people maybe like don't.
Yeah. I can't think of many people in my life who haven't had that experience and it be wrapped around the the context of queerness and queer identity, or feeling deviant in some way or on the outside, or having to mask or overcompensate to be accepted or loved. And I have certainly had that experience. I have a bumper sticker that says, I love to yearn, and it's true.
Yeah.
But I don't do as much of it in my life anymore because I've just learned to see that as an experiential feeling and not so much a part of my identity. So, is that a general theme for this person, or is that a part of their identity? Meaning, would this person still feel that way even in a partnership?
Yeah,
Does that feeling go away in partnership?
it's totally possible to have a partnership where you're still in that zone. And that could be out of like the dynamics between the two people. It could be the other person kind of creating a situation like with a power dynamic, or it could just be like that's the way that one has grown accustomed to like desiring. And that, I think there's a question of whether that's like comfortable or not. Like you said, that you've gotten to a place where you kind of put yearning in its place rather than thinking that that's the only way of
Yeah,
being. And
right.
I think that's important, like, because I was bringing it up as an identity formation, but I think, yeah, there's stories that we tell about it, right? And like I think that this letter is kind of is telling a story about how this person understands themselves through this kind of idea of yearning. And I do think that like that I have in my own life tried to like go past that narrative, because in a way the position of yearning kind of like narratives do forecloses certain possibilities and like kind of determines other
Totally.
possibilities. Right.
Right.
So you're
Right.
always, if you're the yearner, you're always sort of in need, and there's someone else who's there who will be able to like potentially fulfill your need, which, you know, no one ever actually does that.
Right.
But like that puts you in this like kind of ever present, like it's like a supplicant position, right? Like
It
you're like
is.
begging for something in a way. And then that also can make it hard to make connection, because if you come off as like want, it's not like the playing the game or whatever, but it's like I think like sometimes an overwhelming desire can either feel like scary or overwhelming or off-putting in some way.
Well, and it leaves you vulnerable
Yeah.
to relationships are only interfacing with that part of you.
Right.
And that can be really, really unfulfilling. I do want to tend to what I am hearing in the overall letter, which is some validation that this person's reality is true, which is that it's really hard to be single,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah. Yeah.
they don't experience in anarchist and leftist and queer worlds enough attention paid to the people who aren't coupled up or aren't in any sort of relationship structure. And I do want to take a minute to talk about how painful that is and really validate this person's experience, because that's the yearning that I'm picking up on in the letter, is this
Hmm.
person saying, like, please validate this experience, right? Like, I'm not crazy. Like,
Right.
even in communities or, systems that are dedicated to deconstructing and kind of breaking things down and not relying so much on, like normative relationship structures or normative political structures, right? Like, it sounds like this person saying, like, wait, everyone is still privileging this one particular aspect of this thing that we're all trying to collectively tear down, and what fucking gives, right? And this person is feeling that especially painfully because they are in an experience of being so isolated.
Yeah, I think that's right. And like just to think about the letter, right, we like first dug into this position of yearning, which is sort of how the letter starts out. But I think that the person writing has like a lot of knowledge and like some good boundaries around this too. And so I think you're right to shift that emphasis. But the one connection I think in terms of like queerness is that a lot of like, you know, with sexuality and gender, a lot of the what happens between people, right? Like your sexuality is sort of defined by whom you desire, who you're with, or whatever. Like, and I yeah, so maybe there's this feeling too. I mean, like this creates the yearning thing, and the fact that like when you're like first starting to kind of come to terms with your sexuality, you like never know if the person shares that kind of desire with you, right? Like,
Right.
and that can be really hard. But then when you're like maybe in a, you know, older or whatever it is, in this other situation, it's like there's some kind of unfulfilledness if you're not in a couple, which I think that sucks.
Have you felt that way before? Like, have you had the experience of being, of feeling kind of terminally single? I'm going to borrow some language that's maybe a little more like heteronormative, but have you had that experience where you have looked around you and been like, every fucking person in my life has someone, and I don't have someone?
Yeah, I've definitely had those moments, but like for me, the story is usually like I'm gonna end up alone. Like I'm like there's something wrong with me that makes me inevitably or like ultimately unable to maintain some kind of relationship and that I like deserve and will end up alone because of my whatever, the impossibility of me. And so there's something that like ends up being super familiar about the aloneness, the solitude, which can either feel good or bad, which, you know, like, because the other side of what this person's talking about, like, a lot of people who are in real relationships often will envy the position of a single person who like has space and a kind of freedom that doesn't necessarily happen. Depends on your relationship. Some relationships, couples are like very free, but like the typical standard of like how couple, which is a heteronormative standard of how couples do, it really does curtail some of your autonomy, right? So I think there's like sometimes a kind of grass is greener feeling. You know, there's also just this thing about your one's experiences is in a way just completely limited to your interiority, right? And so this position of whatever of not being in a couple, it's like it feels like fate in a way, you know?
I'm glad you said that. I really relate. I don't relate currently to this letter, but I can imagine having written it at one point because I did for many, many years live in this state of like deep, deep longing for partnership and kind of pinballing between possibilities and trying this kind of dating and connecting, and then trying this kind of dating and connecting. And then, you know, being like, well, I don't really feel chemistry with this person, but I'm going to go on 5 dates with that, you know, like creating these rules for myself. And I felt totally hopeless. And I felt like nothing that anyone said to me was going to make a fucking difference unless it was somebody saying to me, you're right, this is really hard. And I'm
Yeah.
really sorry that you're going through this. And ultimately, the thing that was helpful for me was identifying that, naming it, and having people in my life who were willing to bring me into some of their intimacy in a more, I don't know, like I third wheeled it for a really long time, and I loved it actually. Like once I kind of got into that state, I was like, this feels fine. You know,
Yeah.
like I really kind of flourished in that position in some of my friendships, and I'm not saying that that is what this person needs to do. They may already be experiencing that, but I wonder how many of the people in this person's life are 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 validating their pain and also making attempts at including them in their world.
Right. I mean that's ultimately the dilemma for this person because like they seem to have like a good understanding. They're not going to force a relationship, right? Because like they're saying
Mhm.
their friends are trying to set them up or like to say that you should like be with people you don't feel the connection with, and that's not true, right? That doesn't work out in the end. Just filling the hole with anybody is not a good answer, right? And then you get stuck in something or just feel terrible. So it's really like there's something about the kind of the milieu where this person is existing that isn't accommodating or like you're saying kind of affirming of their experience. And that, yeah, that sucks. Third wheel stuff, like I've had good experiences with that depending on who the people are, or also sometimes it feels like, oh, I'm your child. Like it's like this couple and a child, and that can get, for me, that could feel bad. But it's really true that first of all, I think people in couples like can get blinded by their experience, and it is weird and true that couples like gravitate towards each other. This has never been my way of doing things personally, although I've been in couples where the other person's like, we hang out with couples, and tends to me to like feel like I'm gonna die if I hang out in couples, like only couples. I don't like it, but that world can become closed off in a way. And yeah, I think that's shitty, and it does speak to some of the kind of power dynamics are like even in the queer world, like a sticking power of sort of heteronormative relationships that like we can only relate in these formations. It's like part of the kind of like, oh, there's a threat if someone is like available. If you're single, you're also a threat to like the illusion of a relationship, like of a
Mhm.
kind of like a forever partnership or whatever, right? Because you're like, oh, you can always just go do it alone. Like I've found this like when I have like breakups and then I'm like a threat to my friends who are in like long-term relationships because they're like, oh, you can just do that, right? Like you can like whatever, get rid of the thing that you've defined yourself through for X number of years or whatever. So I think that might also be an element of it. So I mean, yeah, maybe like, oh, and I also just want to acknowledge the difficulty, right? Like this is something that people talked a lot about during the pandemic, the isolation that's really, I think, kind
Yeah.
of become more intense since 2020, especially like because the pandemic is ongoing and a lot of people are still feeling isolated by it and are isolated by it. And especially because like like the kind of there's been no, continual care taken around it or that there's such a difference in how people like relate to it. And then the like heaping mass of more and more terrible things. So like not having someone to share that with in a way, which like a coupling has a kind of pre-made version of that.
Right.
So like the kind of like practical thought about that is like, is this, it's the lesson from something like relationship anarchy is that that it's not only in like romantic slash sexual partnership that you find your most fulfilling relationships, right? And like even people who are really entrenched in something like that can't truly get all their needs met in that relationship.
Right. Right.
And like I've had romantic relationships where like some of my deep needs are met in friendships and that are not that relationship, but like that relationship is still incredibly powerful, the romantic one, but so are the friendship. I don't know. Like you think about it differently, like where, maybe the like kind of connection that you need around the terribleness of 2024 doesn't have to be through romance necessarily. And that for me, so then I want to just like kind of acknowledge something that I feel that maybe is connected. Like one of the things I think maybe sometimes the thing that I am like sort of envious of and yearning for often is what I see as people with like really good friend groups rather than partnerships, because like part of my feeling of being alone is often feeling like I'm not part of anything. And like when I see people who have these like close friends who take care of each other and like it's not romantic, but and they may even like have like physical intimacy that's not sexual, like that sounds really nice to me. I'm like, how do people get that? Like, do you have to have like it always feels like you have to have had that for like many, many years to make it be in that place and or just have people who are willing. It's not the norm. So I think that's another aspect of it is that like a lot of kind of friendships don't create this space that fulfill some of these needs that you can fulfill outside of like the typical norm of a couple.
Yeah. One thing that I've talked to many people about and is something that I had to hold for myself when I was in this state of yearning was that there was kind of no formula to get me what I wanted. And a lot of people that I saw around me who were in some kind of romantic partnership, no matter kind of the shape of that partnership, was that it was just fucking dumb luck, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, that's
Like,
been my experience. Like if
yeah.
I stop looking for it, then something happens. It never
But it's
happens
just
when I'm looking.
right. It's just like totally unquantifiable. I'm looking at this person's letter and I just want to come back to, some of the questions that they have around, am I better off single? And I really wish more anarchists embrace this and people and couples tried harder to support single people in their life. I'm wondering what you were alluding to this just now, Shuli, but what is it that this person is missing out on? Right? Like if they know some of those things, who are the people in their life that they can go to and say, I am really missing having somebody to watch a TV show with. I am really missing somebody to call and talk about my day with. I am really missing somebody to make breakfast with. I don't know. I'm kind of curious about what it maybe this person's already doing it, but what it might be like to really clearly name and frame some of those asks within their friendships.
I think
And
that's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you identify it, because like when you're in the position of yearning, it's like this overwhelming desire that can't necessarily be parceled out into like the like things that might actually feel fulfilling. Like it's like it becomes mystical, right? It's like, oh, there's something, right? Even the idea of Basheret, like that you would have someone who like completes you in a way, and like the fucking Jerry Maguire. Like, but which isn't actually true in the sense that like the heteronormative thing makes it so like kind of breaking it down into like, oh, these are the things, the like actual activities or like feelings that I'm looking for, and how could I meet those? Who in my life that already like exists might be someone I could share that with, and like someone you feel comfortable talking about it with. I think is also that creates intimacy, right? When you share some of this stuff and like the hard feelings that you're having really can create intimacy. And so like if you could break it down into the like specific kind of things, because if you think about it, that like that one person is never going to come in and take care of all the things that you want and fulfill you single-handedly, that you actually are always going to have to be finding what you're finding out what you want, because that is also very hard. And then finding out where you can actually do those things. It's going to always really be piecemeal. So I think approaching it from that perspective is good. And then the other thought to add to that is like having this sense of, first of all, boundaries, which this person is already talking about, right? Like that they're not just like dating anyone, even though their friends seem to be pushing them to that. And I think that's really important, because this is really a question of like realizing what makes us feel good and what doesn't, right? Sometimes we just keep hanging out with people that don't make us feel good and think it's our fault. And it might just be whatever. There's like no like reason for it, right? It's just like this just isn't the thing. Just like with relationships, when you don't click, it happens with like friendships. And so if this person's like surrounded by people who can't see them and understand their thing, like maybe that's also feeling bad, and it's like a suck on them, on their energy. And so I think like being intentional about I've been trying to work on this lately too, just because I feel like overwhelmed and exhausted all the time. I'm like, where am I going to put my energy? Like, what? Like, what? Okay. And then on the other hand, one thing I'm thinking about, going back to this kind of identity or whatever, it's the way I've talked about like living with your ghosts before. But like, if yearning is this powerful vector in your life, how do you live with that as part of you, right?
Right.
As something that
Right.
you're producing from within you, regardless maybe of the people in your
Right.
life. How do you come to terms with that? Like,
And
what
what
does
does it
that?
mean if you are partnered and you still have that?
Yeah, I mean, there's people who feel constant yearning towards their partner, and there's people who are partnered and feel constant yearning towards other people. Like, if that's part of you, maybe there's a way to kind of relate to it that feels good, that is familiar, right? It's familiar and is part of you, and like you're like, oh, this old thing. Like, how do I live with it? Yeah, I think that might change your orientation to it, because if we receive the signal of yearning as something is wrong that we must
Yeah.
fix,
Right.
then we're always put in this kind of, again, like it's the supplicant position of like waiting for someone to come along and fulfill this, rather than being like, I have this thing that goes on, right? Like for me, like as someone who likes to write, that yearning feeling can be generative for writing, like
Yeah.
the sort of poetic mode that I feel like
Right.
I'm this like separated thing wandering through the world, seeing
Yeah.
it. I don't know. So that those are just some final thoughts on my part.
Yeah. I really hope that this person follows up and reaches out and shares what they, yeah, think of our response, because in my experience, this is one of the hardest things to talk to people about,
Yeah.
because it just feels so impossible when that person is like, here's the thing I want. I don't have it. Everyone's giving me shitty advice. I still don't have it. I'm trying all these things. I still don't have it. No one's kind of rearranging how they're living in order to accommodate my pain. Like, it's just so hard. And so I would be interested to have this person follow up. And I really felt for them.
Yes, I invite you to like tell us also if you found our response lacking, because I would like to keep thinking about this too. So.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, I'll move on to the next one.
Okay.
I recently realized I couldn't continue being friends with someone who was a close friend of mine due to ethical opposition to their job/the institution they work at. Due to initially not knowing their job and then believing they were going to leave their job, We ended up becoming close friends over the course of a year, connecting over chronic illness, being queer, and figuring out our lives. I truly came to love them and treasure them, and they are a wonderful friend in practice. Recently, though, they told me they want to stay at their job even after being offered a new one. I had to drop the delusion that they are trying to change their line of work. I'm listening to my values by distancing myself from them, but it feels like I'm going against my interpersonal values of being a direct and communicative friend. Because we share so many friends and live in the same neighborhood, I'm attempting to avoid a direct conversation where I have to respectfully say I ethically disapprove of their life's work. It's been really difficult and has felt horrible, especially their history of being ghosted by important people in the past. I'm still responding promptly to their requests to hang and just declining. I feel so bad and think about it every day. Is this just part of breaking up? Can doing the right thing feel wrong? Should I switch my approach and directly communicate?
So if we're going from these like last three questions, right? Should I switch my approach and directly communicate? Yes. Can doing the right thing feel wrong? Yes. Is this just part of breaking up? Also, yes.
Right.
And let's start there.
Although with the directly communicate, okay, so I have a caveat there, right? Like, yes, first of all, this person says it's in their value system to communicate directly to their friends. And so part of what they're feeling that's bad is that they're not telling this other person why they're avoiding them. And like that totally makes sense to me that that would feel bad because you have like this knowledge that this other person doesn't have, which could be making that person feel weird. On the other hand, if you are truly ending a relationship, if that's what this person is going towards, I don't think you owe it to someone to tell them. Like sometimes not telling someone is actually kind, right? Like if you're just like I can't I mean this isn't this situation where I can't fucking stand you. Like a person doesn't need to hear that, right? But
Right.
in this situation though, because there is a sort of ethical consideration, and if you feel like this job is really bad for the person and also obviously bad for the world, and you care about this person enough to like want to consider that they could like realize this or change themselves, then this conversation is actually something that would be worthwhile to have,
It'd be super
because
valuable.
the only sort of power you have in this really is the withdrawal of your friendship, and that could be a penalty that this could be the line, right? Like the person could make all kinds of rationalizations of why they need the job, but like losing friendships over it, they might not be willing to go that far. So that's another way of thinking about that part of the question.
Right. Has anybody said this to this person before? Like, has this person had the experience of someone saying to them, like, I really like spending time with you. I'm really confused about why you do this work.
Well, it
Right.
seems from the letter that this it seemed to me, my interpretation was that this was a conversation, because it said like they
Yeah.
told me they want to stay at their job
Yeah.
even after.
Right. That they've changed their mind, or that they've changed the plan. They've changed their mind. They're going to stay at the job. I mean, oh, there's so many things to consider here, right? And like, we don't need to know what this job is, but if this person's queer and chronically ill and they decide to stay with this job, that could be for a lot of reasons having to do with healthcare. It could have to do with benefits. It could have to do with, them being able to fucking survive, right? Like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what this person's job is.
Yeah, I have been thinking about this a lot, like because of being a chronically ill person since I was a teenager and relying on healthcare, how the fear around all of that has just dictated so many of my decisions in my life. And like sometimes I feel really regretful about. Yeah, and just
Yeah.
the fear of instability, because like the illness can always totally destabilize your life no matter what the circumstances are. So like I think that's just the first of all, that creates a general fear in your life. And then to whatever extent you can have control of your environment sometimes feels really important. And that can limit your senses of possibility. Like where like I see other people living lives that seem freer to me because they don't have that consideration. They can take bigger risks sometimes than I felt that I was able to, which may or may not actually be true, but like that's this sort of sense of fear. So I think like that is something to consider. Of course, like, yeah, maybe they're like, I wouldn't have become a cop,
Right.
or whatever, out of that fear. There are lines that I would draw, but like, yeah, I don't know. The employment is like a big thing for people, right? When you don't have if you don't have a safety net to fall back on.
And I'm not saying that we need all of those details to respond to this person's inquiry, but those are the questions that came up for me when reading it. Not so much like, okay, justify this decision, but just more curious about the conversations that had been had, like, and I think that the point you're making is really, really, really solid, which is that if the writer needs to hold that boundary and indicate that their ability to be friends with this person kind of ends here. That might be really useful information and feedback for their friend.
Yeah.
Um, so the reason I felt so strongly in favor of directly communicating is not because I get the sense that this writer is going to say, fuck you and fuck your job and I hate you, right? But it seems like the writer is probably going to, what could approach it respectfully and thoughtfully and say, we've had these conversations about your work before, and I'm just finding that I can't actually be present in this relationship while I know that you are simultaneously making your money doing something that I'm ethically opposed to.
Right. No, maybe this person, the writer, feels like they've been deceived or something because they like got into a relationship with someone who like seemed to have shared the values, even if they were in a kind of potentially contradictory position. This person could have presented themselves as like, I know this is shitty and I'm like going to change, right? And like then not come through with that, that could feel, bad for this person who's writing, and that's understandable. My one like critical point of view though is like, this is something I think about a lot. When you get to the point in any situation where your overwhelming desire is to control someone else's actions,
Yeah.
I think it's really time to think about what you're doing there, right? And I think about this in terms of like, it's like really a big thing in fucking planning actions and organizing and shit. Like I see this like so much because people will try to shame each other into certain kinds of actions. It's definitely true in relationships, right? And like people want to control. I find this also like as a teacher when I'm like, if my students are just like not doing anything, and then I'm like, I get it like pulls out an authoritarian streak in me that I have to like be like, what the fuck? What am I
Yeah.
doing?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
like forcing people into action is not what is not, it doesn't actually have a good outcome usually, right? Like this is the lesson of like state communism and capitalism. Right? Like, you can't make it work. Yeah. So I just think like to kind of suggest to the writer, like think about this. I'm not saying that you're definitely probably not wrong that the job is like shitty, right? But in terms of your relationship with this person, if your overwhelming desire is that like your values need to determine what they do,
Mhm.
like that's a misalignment, right? And like I would think about enacting that kind of authoritarian impulse, you know?
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you said that. And I had a pretty strong reaction to this letter because of that reason. And I don't know all of the nuances or the ins and outs, but upon a first reading, my thought was, okay, it sounds like you've made your decision.
Right.
Like you've like made this decision, and I understand what you're saying, surely. Like we don't owe people, like yes, that I agree, like we don't owe that. And especially I think there is a point at which sharing certain information, like the harm that it could incur interpersonally kind of outweighs like kind of holding like rigidly to an ethical or moral compass. However, just based on this letter, I do get the sense that this person could say, you may have noticed that I'm declining to hang out. This is why.
Yeah. I mean, I think if this person wants to live in line with their values as they're saying, then that would make sense to be like very upfront about it, even though it might be painful,
Right.
awkward, hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
And they
that's what.
can't control the friend. They just can't, even saying like, I'm going to withdraw my friendship now, like having to let go of any desire or let go to the extent that you can, right? Like maybe we can't fully let go of these desires, which I think are completely normal to have, but, kind of like releasing some of the hope that maybe by saying, I can't be your friend anymore if you work at this job is going to make the person go, oh my God, you're totally right.
Yeah.
Like, I need to leave this job. Maybe that will happen, but it sounds like probably not.
Yeah.
Like person's been at this job for a year. They've decided to stay. Again, that could be for a lot of different reasons. We don't necessarily need to know those reasons, but
It's just a fact of like if you're, in whatever kind of, I mean, I think this is very true in anarchist world. Like it's a fact as you're growing up that people who you've shared, experiences and risks and politics with will buy back into the system, right? There's an overwhelming pressure to make people come back in, and it especially happens around aging and illness and all these things.
yeah, I'm glad
People will
you're.
just get lost, right? Or they're just like enticed by it, or they like weren't as committed to their values or whatever it is. And it's also true that when people take up positions, they often get corrupted by them as they start identifying with their position in the institutions, right? I've seen this with like rad people who are like supposedly rad people in academia, right? Like if you go through enough of academia, you like lose your radicalness and like identify with your position in the institution, and that just sucks. It sucks. It sucks. And that's the way that this terrible world is reproduced. But it's just like I there's no solution to that beyond forcing people into doing things.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's hard. And so back to the breakup. I think this is a breakup for you, and it's probably painful and sucks that you shared a lot with this person, and but there was an ultimate wall that hit. I hope that you find other people that you actually, vibe with more and that are more reflective of your values, because I don't think this situation seems like it's that anymore.
Yeah, it doesn't. It seems like the strain and conflict, whether internal or external, of this person's work is getting in the way of deepening the friendship.
Yeah, things run their course.
That's what we're all about here.
Yeah, like this relationship will still have a place in your life that could be important, and part of its importance is that it didn't last.
Yeah, beautifully put. I love that. Yeah. Okay.
All right. This last one has a lot, so we want to give some time to it.
It does. And I'm going to read it as written.
Yeah.
Hi, I got ghosts. I do not ever hear any utterances, new cries, or new words from my ghosts. All that changes is the tone I hear and the meanings I hear. Decades on, I feel no hope of ever rousting out my ghosts in some territorial victory. The other week, I had a victory of allowing a good change, in my view, of their view of me. They can live on the same ground as me and have their voice, one voice, in all the voices of the world. Have tips on helping that to work well in the long run? Question mark. Or to speak more literally, I'm seeking better ways to live my heart in a world where a scientific journal publishes online, and so far, very few people per year read. My ex's spectacularly violative, several thousand word hate piece about fake me, integrated classist and ableist and medical and sexual abuse, text only body horror revenge porn with faked redeeming social importance in quotation marks, recounting their rape of me, which they don't realize was rape, adding that I, quotation marks, needed it, yet framing as a bad thing that I did to them, and narrating it with overtones of public ritual murder of me, no pretense at de-identifying me other than assigning me a pseudonym that is a mashup of my first name with the word devil, essentialization, ahistoricization, and many varieties of dehumanization, including portraying me as death, capitalized death. It is funny, unintentionally. This helps a little sometimes. X won't budge, journal won't budge. Other consulted institutions ratify this. I quit trying to budge them, and I still don't want the public fight. I want a good world instead of our world, and I want it for my hating ex as much as I want it for me. I can't even fight for that world unless they get to have it too. What helps us to live holding up a wish for the liberation of someone long gone who we lifelong bone deep want the best for, who only wants us dead. You might decide that this is too long for reading all of it on the pod. I trust you to edit it down. We did not edit it down. No need. We get
No.
to, yeah, it gets to be the full letter.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of this person's feeling comes out in the way that they wrote the letter, so I think it's important. In a way, I see a few different things going on in here that deserve response. And first of all, I just want to acknowledge that this situation that this person's been in, it seems like for a very long time, is like intolerable and painful, right? Like someone put something out there in the world that is violent towards you, is reiterating assault on you, and exists constantly as a possible like reignition of all that trauma, and that your attempts to change that have been completely fruitless. You've been denied the ability to have like an outcome in that, and that's fucking terrible. There's nothing else to say. I mean, there's obviously a lot to say, but there's nothing else I can say about that situation like that makes it tolerable for you, right? And it's like not your fault, because like you've tried. Like if the journal and the ex refused to like withdraw this piece. Like, I mean, I don't know what the recourse is there. And it seems like the only kind of relief is that it's not widely circulated, but that's like a pittance, obviously, towards the pain.
Yeah. But if I'm remembering it correctly, this person said, I quit trying to budge them and I still don't want the public fight.
Right.
So I don't know if that means that they are saying, okay, so the overall sense from this letter, other than kind of the horrific violence that they're experiencing through this, is that they're saying, I want a good world. And I realize that if I want the good world, they get to have it too.
Yeah.
Right. Like if I want to be in practice of building something where this doesn't happen, then the person who did this to me gets to be in that world as well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like what I'm taking overall from this letter, because if I'm interpreting it correctly, they're saying this has happened. This happened to me. It's not being taken down. It's not being budged. I don't want to have a public fight about it. Which, God, it just like it all makes sense.
Yeah. They are drawing a line, right? They're not going to do a public call out. They're not going to draw attention outside of the redress of the institutions that they've already tried and that haven't failed. They're not going to make a big deal out of that. And there could be a variety of reasons that are totally understandable for that. I mean, the main one being that, like, being in the position of the person who like was harmed or a victim is like a really degraded position that often doesn't get heard and can isolate you further and whatever, make everything feel a lot fucking worse. So God, I mean, I know, like, it makes me think of, there's many situations, like, within the queer anarchist world, of harm and attempts at like accountability that don't go right. And I've heard of a lot of experiences of situations where, like, whatever harm was done, there's no accountability that like is going to feel good, right? I mean, everyone has to acknowledge that once the harm is done, it's not undoable. But I know that there are people who have been harmed who aren't asking for accountability, right? That's like a hard line, right? There's not something that this person's going to do to make you feel good about anything. And yet you are like holding out this like love for
Right.
this
Love is the
person.
word that came to mind for me too.
Because often in that experience, like, the way that it comes out into community is like people are like, oh, well, I don't want this person to be at anything I ever do or whatever, right? But you're like, yeah, you're taking some other tack, which I think it's powerful. It's powerful, right? And maybe in a way, it's like the one power you have in this situation is to will this world where this person is in it and could potentially be liberated too. Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's powerful. I really, that's where I'm where I'm ending with this comment.
Yeah, I do too. I got chills when you said that actually. And something that I want to acknowledge is if anyone listening hears in my voice, or maybe even also in Julie's, kind of I'm finding that as I'm thinking about this person's letter, the words aren't coming to me as easily, right? Because I think I'm just sitting with the weight of it, and the acceptance of it, or I'm trying to find like a better word than acceptance, but the writer seems to have come to this like incredibly hard won place of like, this isn't changing. And yet I'm standing very clear in my conviction that if the world changes and there's no more room for violence and medical abuse and sexual abuse to be like reproduced over and over and over again, and for this person's body to be like profited upon, right? They still want the people who harmed them to be there and like be able to enjoy that world as well. And I'm touched by that. Touched maybe is too precious a word, but I'm moved by that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm just moved by it, and I'm heartbroken that this happened. And
Yeah, we've given space in this podcast before to another kind of feeling in this situation, which is like one of desire for revenge.
of course,
And
yeah,
I think that, there's some people who are like in abolitionist transformative justice world who think the desire for revenge is like the worst is the worst thing. It's like defining of our terrible world. I personally understand it and think that it's something that, if it's not legislated, is like it's an inescapable part of our experience, and it's totally understandable. And I've been in situations where that seems like the only, I mean, not revenge and even necessarily something that you do, but like the only possible acceptable outcome is like like ending this situation, is not like fixing it or whatever. And you're taking a different, the letter writer Lumen is taking a different approach to this. Like, they're not being driven by a desire to revenge, which I think, also being driven by revenge alters your orientation to the world in a
Yeah.
way. And, not to like be like victim blaming, but when you're oriented through that, it's like the harm, the trauma, the assault is like defining you in a way. And so I think like you've had the experience of being unable to alter the conditions that are continuing the harm. And so you're like, it seems like your response to that is to find some place to, instead of being in a maybe powerless position of wanting revenge and not being able to have it in any way, or to like will something else. And I think you're not doing like Christian forgiveness, which also feels very paltry when people put that on a victim. You're doing something else which seems true to your like to a liberatory desire to imagine that like liberation means all people's liberation, like we don't pick and choose. And I think that's really hard because a lot of like leftist like way of thinking universalizes everything in the way that like like everyone will be liberated in the same way. And I mean, as an anarchist, I'm like, no, like it's going to be a still going to be a fucked up world if we were all liberated, right? Like everyone's going to get liberated, and there's people I hate and disagree with in that as well. But yeah, coming at it from love, I think is interesting. I was like, also, I was I was at this talk the other night with G Voucher and Penny Rimbaud from Crass, and they're like, Penny talks about being the last of the hippies. That's his memoir. But they both kept thinking like love is the only important thing. They're like, they're the peace people. But then he said something about how love is a great destroyer, and I was like, damn, I like that way of thinking about it, because when you say, oh, love, 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 like, the like John Lennon feeling of it, it feels like weak in a way, like a weak response to the terror of this world. But like imagining love as this destroyer, like, I mean, we are totally our bodies are like taken apart and put back together through our experiences of love. And in a less maybe extreme example, like a lot of us have to go through harmful, painful relationships and survive them somehow. And like the dilemma that you get into often is like how like having to survive in a world where that person still exists that holds all of this like terrible stuff that you went through. And that's like I don't know, I think that facing that head on is an important part of experience, right? To be like this, there's a person out there who could hate me, who's harmed me, and yet they like continue to exist, and I'm living with that. And also someone who I shared love with, right? Like that, like, which is something that this person, the writer, is emphasizing, right? That there's still like there's this deep depth of feeling that's not simply like harm in it. And that's just like, I mean, that's really, I think that's going back to the beginning of the question. That's about the ghosts, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. While you were saying that, what I was picturing was a forest fire.
Yeah.
So this just destructive element that is in service to love and regeneration. And yeah, I like what you said. I like that.
So let's go to the beginning, right? Because it's like this is the situation you're in when you're giving up control because you maybe have no power in it, and so you're living with the ghosts. And the person says, like, the ghosts are kind of repetitive, no new utterances, no new cries, no new words. The only change is like how they hear it and the meaning they make of it. And so it seems like they've given up. They said the idea of like kind of having victory over the ghosts. The only victory that they've said they had is like this is interesting, a change in their view of what how the ghosts view them, which I think is, I mean, that's also like one of these powerful moments in life, is to be like, how much of the meaning that I'm making and the structures that I'm forcing myself into are projections of how I think other people see me, right? And so they've come to this place of living on the same ground with these ghosts. And the question that they ask from this is like, tips on helping that to work well in the long run. I mean, it's this question of surviving and what you bring along with you, and that you don't control it all. Before we started recording, I told Caroline that I like was melancholy, and I kind of was like pushing into it, which is my practice of like feeling feelings rather than trying to fix them or escape them. And that's how I've related to my ghosts too, because they haunt you at all moments, and often come in the most painful ways when you don't want them. Like for me, it's like insomnia or like whatever, like a constant cyclical thought of something. And I mean, yeah, the language of battle is one way of thinking about it, but another way, like if you imagine yourself as a haunted house, right? And you're
I knew you were about to say that. Yeah.
and you're the hostess of this house. Like, how do you accommodate these ghosts in such a way that they are not constantly rattling their chains at you, right? Like you can't get rid of them. And so or erase them. And so there's just like, I mean, I think this changes over time, and it changes with your like the current situations you're in, the relationships you have, and your understanding of things. Like you said, you've shifted now in your understanding of how the ghosts are seeing you, which is maybe a release for you, that you're not like tied up. It sounds like you are actually in a position of some kind of self-empowerment, not a position of like total destruction of yourself.
I don't have much to respond to that. I love everything that you just said. And it's what I would want to hear if I had written this.
Yeah, I mean, like I felt sort of powerless reading this, but I was also kind of bowled over by the power of the letter itself, which was, beautiful and painful. And so like the basic thing that I think we can offer you is a kind of recognition. I guess we see you in this. I mean, I had this first like thought, I'd be like, oh, how could I like help like get this thing down or whatever? Like surely it's possible. But barring that possibility and the anonymity and all of that, like I like see you, I see your power, I see your love, and that power to me is like is incredible, and it's something that I would like to embody in my life too, so that I'm not completely defined by all the pain and shit that I've been through. And so like, I can have those ghosts, and some of those ghosts are of people who are still living that I do want to love in all of the complexities. So that, yeah, I don't know. I mean, your letter is beautiful, and I appreciate you sharing with us.
Yeah, likewise. Well, that's it for this batch.
Yeah, and possibly, I just want to say, like, possibly none of the things we said are sufficient for any of you. And I would love to hear that. If you feel like, we've had this before, like maybe we missed some nuance or something. I'm happy to continue the conversation. And yeah, obviously none of this can like, solve a problem immediately, but hopefully at least lets you feel heard, and then is helpful for other people who go through their own versions of these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, in the mode of love, sending all love out there to the world. Let it destroy everything.
Yeah, let love destroy you. All right. Thanks, everyone.
You've been listening to The Breakup Theory. Rate, follow, share us with your exes. Until next time.